Welcome everyone, Christine here with a discussion about Terminator Dark Fate Defiance. And in this particular video, I am going to be going over some of the campaign essentials that you should be aware of before playing this game. I'll start with the campaign map because this is actually going to be the more important point as opposed to how you deal with battles. Though I will cover those as well on a fairly basic level, but I want to cover the campaign situation on a more detailed level because that's actually quite important. So in the campaign, you will have a mobile force, T-Force, as it's going to be called. Now, you have various resources. You have goodwill points, the purple ones. You have manpower, represented in green, and you have supplies. Now, supplies are going to be fairly limited, and you might end up in situations like this where to move from one place to another, it's going to consume all of your supplies. Now, how do you manage this? Well, here's what you need to know when you're dealing with this game. You will get a lot of units. Let's say you play a mission properly, you minimize your losses, and you get out of there with most of the units intact. Does that mean you keep those units? No. What you should do, in point of fact, is sell a bunch of the stuff that isn't useful for goodwill points and to reduce your supply burden, because a lot of the things you will be picking up aren't going to be particularly useful. First off, let's talk about things that you can get rid of and the way you should build your army, the things you should be looking to prioritize. One of the things I would say you should almost always get rid of are fuel trucks. Station trailers, which you need to pull with the truck, get rid of those. They're useless, they're not really going to add that much. Very rarely will you run out of fuel in a mission, and pretty much every single mission in the game is going to have fuel. What about ammo trailers? Now, this is a bit more tricky because there are plenty of ammo trailers in many missions. However, having at least one, I would say, in your army past the first few missions is probably well worth it. But only one. Most of the time, you will not need more than that in order to tackle a mission. So over here, I would just keep one of them and just get rid of the rest. What about some other things that you could get rid of? Well, it depends on what you're dealing with, but one of the things I would firmly say is like technicals and vans, so basically the movement vehicles, because there's 3 factions, well, 4 really. So there's the integrators, there's the movement, there's the founders, and of course there's the Terminators, Legion. Getting rid of any kind of technical for the most part, unless you needed to pull various things, is generally going to be a good idea. You can always take out weaponry on vehicles if you want to. The crew of the vehicle will never be sold, so you can always sell that. Now, the reason you want to sell a lot of this stuff that you're going to pick up in a mission and very hard for you to maintain it is because, well, you do have a significant supply burden, so you want to reduce that. You also want to get goodwill points to buy equipment so that your better units have better equipment, and on top of that, you want to buy supplies. Almost every major settlement you visit will have a bunch of supplies on sale, so keeping a bunch of this, trash, if you will, around is not really going to add anything to you. You want to pretty much go in every mission. Also, by the way, the APC here is, you might think, oh, the APC is good. No, the APC is not good at all. So just sell a bunch of this stuff that you really don't need to carry along with you. Dozers are kind of one of those things, like when it comes to things like trucks or heavy platforms or anything like that, it depends on if you need them or not. Generally speaking, I would say having a couple of trucks, or 1 or 2 trucks extra in every mission can be exceptionally useful. But yeah, just selling a bunch of this stuff that isn't going to be used. Generally speaking, with regards to other things, you want as many tanks as you possibly can get your hands on, because tanks are 1, rare, 2, very, very powerful. So tanks, things like Bradleys, all that. Like, I went through a lot of this campaign without bothering with upgrading because I figured, oh, well, it's more useful to have as many units. But here's the thing. there's a lot of missions where the meat of the mission is you're going to fight with a limited roster, if not completely in a limited roster. So having a swarm of units sounds useful in theory until you realize in practice that it's actually not as useful as you might think. So getting rid of a lot of this, buying up pretty much all of the supplies that you can in a mission, and then moving on from mission to mission to mission with highly upgraded units is the better thing to do. Like, you gotta balance it out. Like, I would say, don't get rid of the lightest units though. Like, don't get rid of the lightest vehicles. You want a good balance of vehicles, of units. You don't just want heavy vehicles, like you want all types. So you do want things like strikers, you do want things like tanks, you do want things like Bradleys, you do want light artillery that can be mounted on light platforms, the 105mm cannons, and then you want the heavy artillery that can be mounted on a heavy platform. The reason you want to do so is limitations that do get put in various missions, because like, obviously with infantry you want to keep a good infantry variety. Speaking about infantry, when we're talking about infantry, usually speaking, the founder infantry is the best for a number of reasons. But first off, like, you get ATGM squads. You'll start with 2 ATGM squads, you'll start with 2 ranger squads, riflemen, all that. You want to keep it as many of these, like, you want to keep all of them. Like, it doesn't matter how many individual soldiers die as long as the unit survives. And then you want to upgrade them. One really useful upgrade related to supplies, which is one of the reasons founder units are much better, is survivalists. So survivalists will reduce the amount of supplies a unit is using. So you want to pretty much get this on a lot of these units, especially the more expensive ones, in order to reduce their supply intake. It's not important for every single unit that you have. So for instance, it's kind of a bit pointless for a sniper when already, a sniper is already going to consume very, very little to begin with. But it's still pretty useful to get for the most part. And yeah, just when it comes to infantry, just get rid of infantry you don't need. Like, have a good balance of it, to be certain, because you will need a good amount of them, but don't just have 10 units of each type. I'd say 2 or 3 units of each type from each faction, like 2 snipers from the movement, 2 snipers from the founders, 2 rocket RPG squads, 2 ATGM squads. At least early on is really what you want to go. And keep in mind, the better you do, the more supplies you save early on in a campaign, the better off you'll be in the long term. The early game missions in particular, like, for instance, there is a battle here near Santa Fe that can be tricky, but what do you need for a battle near Santa Fe? What units do you need exactly? Well, you do want the tank, you do want the Bradley. Go to the integrator camp, get an ATGM launcher for that. I regret my life choices with respect to that. But artillery is always useful. Javelin teams are always useful. Rangers are always useful. Guerrillas, things like guerrillas are useful. RPG team, heavy weapon teams, less so. Snipers, of course, pretty useful. And then technicians and drivers, because obviously someone needs to drive all those vehicles. What about tanks? Tank drivers and helicopter drivers, etc. Well, when it comes to that, it is a skill you can train in a squad. So, like, if you want someone to drive a tank, you can take a technician and give them that particular skill. You can give a technician, or I do have a command squad over here, you can give them, piloting skills. You can get helicopters. It's just basically helicopters. You won't have that many of them, but you can pick them up. The important thing about helicopters is that they're useful from the perspective of scouting. They can also do aerial insertion, so give you map control from that perspective. But keep in mind, they are going to be pretty vulnerable, but they do give you flexibility on the battlefield that you would be severely lacking otherwise. And quite importantly, don't think about how many supplies do I need to go from point to point, which is what I did to my great mistake. Think about what you're going to do. Try and have as many supplies as possible. Not because there will be necessarily big surprises, which would go really poorly for you, but rather because, you know, it gives you more possibilities. For instance, like here, just using a bunch of supplies clears the road, which means I can go to the shops, the initial shops that were in this campaign. I can reach that, you know, within a day, as opposed to taking multiple days. And I do have tons of supplies available over here. And, you know, if I wanted to, I can get rid of one of these trucks. I don't actually need it right here. Yeah, 2 or 3 light gun platforms, 2 or 3, or 1 or 2 heavy platforms. Artillery really is going to be the king in a lot of these missions. ATGMs, good snipers, having good weaponry on units, all that is what ultimately matters. You won't be able to keep everything. That's kind of annoying about how the game is designed, but that is simply just how it works at the moment. And that's just some of the things to worry about in a campaign. You can disband infantry squads. Keep in mind, some units you may not want to sell. You may want to disband them in general. Like some units are, like basic technicians, are very, very cheap. Like higher ranking ones with upgrades are more expensive. But in general, like technicians who are driving the vehicles are very cheap. So you may not necessarily even want to disband. Though usually, when we're thinking about buying stuff, like, it's fairly damn cheap to buy a bunch of manpower for yourself if you want to replenish any particular unit. So remember that you want to get as many goodwill points as possible in a campaign. Whenever that's possible, you want to get as many of those. And beyond that, beyond getting a bunch of goodwill points, obviously getting a bunch of supplies. Manpower, I would always say just have as little as needed. There are going to be various points where you will get a huge amount of manpower. Now, manpower doesn't cost a lot in terms of like supply, so you can certainly, like over here, like if we look over here, so I'm spending 46,000 supplies. It would go up by 3,000 for 40 guys in manpower. So manpower is pretty cheap. I'd say like anything higher than 40 in as a backup is kind of meaningless. You won't need more than 40 unless you're taking enormous damage in every single mission. And even then, if you get to the next vendor who has manpower, you will be able to usually replenish any kind of losses. Now, useful vehicles, very useful vehicles. Tanks, EMTTs, these are exceptionally useful. The reason they're exceptionally useful is not just because they're self-driving, either fuel tankers or supply tankers. Beyond that, they can also pull artillery pieces behind them. That is, by the way, going to be a very important factor to keep into consideration over here. So having as many of these as possible, obviously very useful. Technicals, vans, a militia. Like, I would not bother with militia at all. Like, militia are pretty damn worthless in a mission. Like, I'd rather get a bunch of guerrillas and give them, you know, plasma shotguns or anything like that, any kind of upgrade in order for them to be useful. Upgrade your tanks with armor. Something you do lose mobility most of the time, like various upgrades for your tanks, various upgrades for your vehicles. Pretty damn useful. Don't bother upgrading your tractors. Like, your tractors generally are going to play a passive role. Their role is to move the artillery pieces into position, and then, yeah, the artillery pieces should never be attacked. Make sure you protect them. So that's what you want to keep in mind on the campaign. Like, have a situation like I do right here, where I have 8 days of supply, and I can go over here at the initial settlements. Though, keep in mind, in this case, I just don't have every single vehicle being pulled properly. Yeah, there we go. Because, like, yeah, there's a lot of micromanagement over here. I'm guessing the developers expected us to lose a lot of units, to not go past the first missions, like, because it's just gonna have this effect in your campaign when you start losing a couple of units. If you lose a lot of units early on in a campaign, it wouldn't be quite as bad. But if you do manage to preserve a lot of the units intact from the first few missions, then obviously that's going to have a knockoff effect. And it can affect the entirety of your campaign going on. So just keep that in mind, keep that particular aspect in mind when you're making decisions with respect to your army. And also bear in mind, you're going to get a bunch of units in a lot of missions or in the aftermath of missions, especially early on in a campaign. You are going to get various things available to you. Okay, that's on the campaign side of things. Let me talk a bit about battles. Now, talking about combat, here's something you should know. There are going to be missions or sections of missions where you're effectively going to face an infinite number of troops. So you need to complete objectives before basically you run out of men or you run out of supplies. Because yes, that can happen in a very prolonged mission. There are enough supplies on the map. Like usually speaking, that you will find enough supplies. Like for instance, over here there is a supply point over here that can keep me going. I've taken the southern point, but there's a good number of enemies that will keep spawning. So the spawn rate, at least on hard difficulty, I didn't play on realistic because I realized very quickly, but the spawn rate is not too horrible, but it is certainly something to bear in mind when you are playing this particular game. What you're going to want to do in order to succeed against an infinite number of enemies is you want to build up strong points, like artillery points, with plenty of vision provided by snipers or forward vehicles like the Abrams. You can get an Abrams fairly early on in the campaign. Make sure you keep that Abrams alive. Like if you lose it, like this game is going to be fairly reload heavy. Like I would not recommend playing this game if you're not interested in reloading ever at any point, or play on a lower difficulty. Like you will lose units because there is certainly plenty of RNG here. Though you can obviously reduce it through good positioning. Like units in a building on the right side of the building, because they can go on random sides, but units in a building on the right side, like javelin teams, RPG teams, can do a lot to slow down an enemy offensive on a particular sector. Like any kind of infantry. And you might be doing a bunch of hopping between buildings over here. When you're attacking an enemy fortified in buildings, what you want to do is send certain infantry, especially heavy infantry, so things like guerrillas, rangers, even militias can do a decent enough job with it, but any kind of like infantry, don't send riflemen or RPGs or javelins for this, but you basically want them to capture that building, and they'll kind of engage in like close quarters combat in a building if there's units inside. It's pretty derpy, I admit, so, but it is something to bear in mind, because if you're just shooting at the building, yeah, sure, you might succeed eventually, but any kind of RPG team, let alone a javelin team in a building, is going to be able to inflict significant damage on you. So for instance, over here, there's an enemy that's fortified in this position. They've got various platforms. They don't have artillery, or they have very little artillery. And by the way, usually speaking, artillery is one of those things that the AI is not going to get an infinite amount of. So if you do eliminate the artillery, you might just do a smash and grab, or just basically a quick assault on a particular section of the enemy line, so to speak, just to take out the artillery. You knock out their artillery, you end up dealing with a major fight. Like I would say artillery, javelin teams are probably some of the most dangerous things, as well as tanks. Like those are your priority targets. And well, when it comes to artillery, you can knock it out completely out of mission. You can't do quite the same thing when we're talking about like javelins or tanks. You might face an infinite number of them, so you do need to win a mission relatively quickly. Avoiding strong points, like over here for instance, there is no good way for me to assault, so I will have to do a full frontal assault, but there's plenty of missions where there are weak points. So one of the things I would recommend some people do actually is when you're deciding how you're going to approach a mission, just scout around. Like yes, this is the kind of game where knowing the layout of each mission, knowing how those missions are going to play out, like what things are, having a helicopter primarily for scouting really, because like a helicopter for instance, it can see all of things from a far greater distance, so it can detect enemy movements. For instance, like over here, they're moving a heavy weapon platform, so it can detect enemy movements and allow your artillery to zero in on a location, or allow you to plan for it. Like over there, like, yes, my chopper is going to take a bit of damage, but let's just get it out of there from that particular position. But you can see that due to the vision that I have, my artillery was able to get a hit in, and now these two are knocked out. One important thing to mention is that crews can be forced out of vehicles, so you can actually capture a bunch of allied vehicles, or when one of your vehicles, like, basically need to get the fire effect. When the fire effect is triggered, what will happen is that, like, crews will be forced out, but they can go back in. You can repair vehicles, you can repair supplies. This is one of the things that, this is the one thing in a mission that you can't actually replenish. So, like, you can replenish ammunition, you can replenish fuel, but you cannot replenish repair supplies in a particular mission. You might also get various vehicle parts knocked out. So, for instance, over here, my tank has lost. My tank has lost its gun capability. I can repair it. Vehicles also have crews, so you might actually just have a perfectly functional tank with a good situation, but you may not have the crew needed for that tank to operate properly. I do find that with tanks, if you go down below, like 2 crew, like just with Abrams specifically, if you go down below 3 crew, that it's not necessarily going to function properly. So just keep that particular aspect in mind. You can repair a vehicle. There's also armor sections that will not be replenished during a mission. They will be replenished after the mission. There's various opposite weapon types, all that. Like, I would say a big gun is generally pretty useful to have. Like over here, if I want to deal with the enemy, one of the things I can do, though I will need to replenish its supplies, but one of the things I can do would be to advance slowly with artillery, for instance, and use the chopper for scouting purposes and just slowly but surely wipe them out. Or I can do advance and retreat with tanks. You can reverse with vehicles, or just start inching closer and closer with javelin teams and artillery until I have gotten fire superiority and I have knocked out the enemies. Those are some of the things to bear in mind. It does take javelin teams some time to get into a good position where they can hit the enemy, so keep that particular aspect in mind as well. Anyway, that's all I had to say. Costin signing out. Stay tuned for more. Of course, there's a lot more to be said on the subject of this game, but just some essential things if you're looking to play this particular title. Stay tuned for more.